I would like to introduce you today to Michael Bodaken. From 1993 to 2018, Michael served as the head of the National Housing Trust. Michael was largely responsible for the growth of the organization into an industry leader, affordable housing and green preservation, targeting grants and loans for energy retrofits of affordable housing. Under his leadership, the Trust won the John D. and Catherine T. MacArthur Foundation Award for Creative and Effective Institutions. He was one of the co-founders of Energy Efficiency for All, a unique combination and collaboration between the National Housing Trust, the National Resources Defense Council, and the Energy Foundation. Under his leadership, the Trust financed and preserved more than 30,000 affordable homes throughout the nation, leveraging more than $1 billion in financing. The National Housing Trust, through its subsidiary, the National Housing Trust Community Development Fund, provides low-interest loans to affordable housing developers across the United States. Through affiliate National Housing Trust Enterprise, the Trust owns and operates nearly 4,000 affordable homes along the East Coast and Midwest. Prior to joining the Trust, Michael worked as Deputy Mayor for Housing for the City of Los Angeles after having practiced public interest law for more than a decade. Welcome, Michael.
Thank you for having me, Nan.
I would like to start out with some topics that relate directly to your background. And let's start with the National Housing Trust. Tell us a little bit about what that is, how it was formed, and what's its role in housing.
Sure. The National Housing Trust is a national intermediary organization that was dedicated and is dedicated to preserving and improving existing affordable housing. It was formed in the mid-1980s to combat the concern about the loss then of subsidized housing, what are termed Section 236 housing, 221d3, HUD-assisted housing. Over time, the Trust became interested in preserving and improving all affordable housing, subsidized and unsubsidized, and in fact did that through a variety of means, including, but not limited to, having a housing development corporation, a real estate ownership entity, a lending entity, which you mentioned, the NHT Community Development Fund, and a policy arm that focused on policies at the state and local and federal government that would promote preservation policies and make it easier for developers to buy, acquire, and improve existing affordable housing. And it's through those three different means we accomplished our mission.
So those interrelate, I assume, and how exactly do you interrelate them?
Well, it starts with the very simple thought that good practice makes good policy, or another way to put it is, without good practice, good policy is really not easily made, and in fact often is wrong. And so there's an interrelationship between practice and policy that is fundamental to how the National Housing Trust operates. And what I simply mean by that is the practice in the field by NHT Enterprise, by the loan fund, and its policy arm are always interrelated. So we promote policies that we in fact have worked on in the field, and that in fact helps inform and make better practice, because the policies that we work on are policies that we think would make a difference for both us and other developers of affordable housing. So that symbiotic link between practice and policy is fundamental to all the National Housing Trust does.
Tell me about the funding.
So one way to look at the trust is that the businesses, the NHT Community Development Arm and the NHT Community Development Fund, the CDFI, the lending fund, and the real estate functions fund themselves essentially. But the policy arm obviously does not generate revenue. So the policy arm is funded by grants from national funders, funders like the JPB Foundation, the Kresge Foundation, and numerous others. So, and in part, the trust, my successor is working on trying to ensure that the businesses help fund more of the policy work, so the trust is not so dependent on foundation grants. And that's kind of the long-term vision for how the trust will self-finance over the next decade.
So the idea of funding by those who benefit from it.
Yes, and most directly from the NHT community development arm, the real estate arm, and the CDFI. To the extent that they can fund policy activities, the trust is less reliant on grants from national foundations. There probably will always be a need to have grants to help fund the policy work, but to the extent the businesses can cross-fund the policy work, the trust is on more stable footing and has a better long-term outlook.
Now we talk about affordable homes, and are you talking about both single family and multifamily?
Almost entirely multifamily. The trust has a number of loans that it's made through its lending arm for single family in what's called a community land trust model. But that's candidly a very modest amount of lending that we do. The vast majority, 95% of what the trust does, is in multifamily.
You know, many of your fellows in the academy have talked about affordable housing because it's a big concern today, and how we have expanded the definition from subsidized to affordable. Talk about that a little bit.
So we all know kind of the numbers out there about for extremely low income people and low income households, we have essentially a housing program of vouchers in Section 8 that covers 1 out of every 4 people who actually qualify for it. Well, those other 3 people, the other 3 people in the room who are not being subsidized, are still having to find shelter. And those millions and millions of households are not all able to get into subsidized housing. So the affordable housing problem is evidenced actually more in what's called naturally occurring affordable housing, where people do what they can to find housing outside the subsidized system for shelter. And in that housing, those people often pay significant amounts of their income, often over 50%, or live in slums. And so the natural way to think about affordable housing is not just the subsidized stock. The subsidized stock is a fraction of the housing out there that is, quote, affordable, that needs to be kept affordable, that is in our housing system. The way to think about it really is it's a pyramid. And at the top 2 levels or so are subsidized stock, but at the broad bottom is all of the market inventory around the nation that is not subsidized and that is, quote, affordable. It might not be very good housing, but it's housing nevertheless that is affordable. And that's where many low-income households are living today.
So is there any move to take that particular supply and focus on rehab?
Sure, there's a lot of efforts. There's a equity trust, the Community Development Trust in New York City, the Housing Partnership Equity Trust, they're based in Boston. A number of relatively modest, privately financed, nonprofit entities have been established to focus on that stock. The federal government is not doing very much in the way of that stock, but other state and local housing trust funds often focus on that stock. It is not unusual for low-income housing tax credits, 4% credits allocated by state housing finance agencies to be used on that stock. And so there's not a policy per se, as much as a lot of disaggregated efforts that focus on that particular stock. But yes, people are very well aware of it. And as I said, it's the elephant in the room. We need to figure out a way to preserve that stock.
It seems like it, because a lot of people, of course, are talking about supply and demand.
right,
and talking about the lack of supply,
right,
particularly, you probably are aware that we're very heavily involved in the voucher program and administer
right.
many housing authorities and voucher programs. One of those is San Francisco, and it's difficult to have people locate housing when your average rent for just a small unit is like $3,000.
Yes, there's the Bipartisan Housing Commission proposed years ago a universal voucher system, especially for seniors and handicapped people. And I think it's probably important to say that in every other industrialized country in the world, there is some form of housing as a right, as fundamental assistance, not unlike food in the United States. In the United States, we provide food stamps to anyone who qualifies. We provide Social Security to anyone who qualifies. We don't provide housing assistance to anyone who, it's not a right in the United States. And that's the consequence of not having the ability to secure a voucher to pay rent in San Francisco or Storm Lake, Iowa, or Utah, or any place. And in fact, the Low-Income Housing Coalition has shown that essentially those low-income households compete like in a crazy game of musical housing for the last opportunity of housing in their neighborhoods. And that happens everywhere. They have to earn enough to afford housing, and there's not enough affordable housing out there for those households. So you have to have a supply assistance program, and the voucher program, if expanded, could provide that and give those households the assistance they need to live where they need.
What do you think about workforce housing, and what would you call workforce housing? How would you describe it?
So I would describe it, I mean, there's lots of different definitions. I would call it housing that's affordable to people who earn between 80 and 120% of median. It's not for the lowest income households. It's certainly at a significant need, especially where the jobs are in many cities. You mentioned San Francisco. One could do a litany of other urban centers where jobs are paying significant amounts of money, but people still can't afford decent housing or own a home. And so there's been kind of a recognition as of housing affordability has slid up the housing income of the income scale that we need to address workforce housing. I don't think we're yet at a place where the federal government can turn its attention to that because of the severe, dire need of those who are extremely low income. But I think anything that is done to provide that workforce housing, at least in theory, would help provide more housing, and which in turn could ratchet down and provide help for those at the bottom end. But it's more of a long-term view. It's not something that's needed essentially right now. What we really need is more housing for those who are extremely low income and low income.
Give us a contrast between the policy in, say, the last 50 years and the policy maybe in the next 20 years.
Sure. So I think it's important to harken back that in the late 40s, FDR did make it clear that housing was something basic should be guaranteed for every American. We just never made that promise real. That was a promise given to the American people, and that promise was never really realized. But what we did was we did have federal housing programs that tried to make that promise real, that tried it. So you had, and you and I know about these programs, subsidies provided to developers through rent supplements. We had subsidies to mortgages through the Section 236 program and the D3 program. And literally millions of apartments were built by for-profit developers and nonprofit developers, essentially between the 2 decades, between 65 and 85, before they were shut down. And then we had a Section 8 voucher and project-based Section 8 program that helped millions and millions, and public housing, which helped millions. And altogether, we probably have helped out 10 to 12 million households a year annually. But we've stopped increasing those programs. So today, the federal programs, as you're well aware, it's mainly a containment policy, and we're managing actually a decline down a mountain of federal housing programs, trying to our best to stop any more cuts But the idea of expanding federal housing policy has essentially been eroded through the past 2 decades. So the future, if there is a future, lies with state and local housing finance agencies. There is no question that the low-income housing tax credit is the most efficient, most well-regarded, and probably the place where Republicans and Democrats could agree over time to expand housing assistance for low-income Americans. So I'm of the opinion that if we're going to try to figure out a way to expand housing assistance in America, it's to focus on vouchers at the federal level, but understand how difficult that is, and to turn our attentions really to the state and local housing finance agencies, expanding tax credits for all, perhaps putting together a significant sum for those who are extremely low income, and I want to underscore this, targeting tax credits for energy efficiency and rehabilitation, because that lowers the cost of developing housing, which in turn should accrue to the benefit of those who rent. And 20% of our operating funds come from utilities. The National Housing Trust utility bill was $2.5 million a year when we started retrofitting our properties. It's now to $1.8 million today. Every developer in America should be looking at their utility bill. Every owner in America should be looking at their utility bill and saying, how can I reduce this by 20%? Which in turn would lower operating costs, which would reduce the need to raise rents. And that's another internal way for us to deal with the affordable housing crisis going forward over the next 2 decades.
So do you think there is a move to do that?
Oh, there's no question. There's something like 45 states who are now prioritizing the energy efficiency of affordable housing in their qualified allocation plans and how they deal with allocating credits. So when you compete for tax credits in 45 states in America, you have to show that part of your application is going to be energy efficiency or solar or both. That didn't exist 10 years ago. That didn't exist 5 years ago. And so today we have a significant amount of state and local attention being paid to this. And to the extent we can expand that pot at the federal level, the state and localities understand that you can reduce your operating costs, provide rental energy efficiency, and oh, by the way, help the environment.
Even if it is an afterthought.
Yes, oh, by the way, yes, P.S., save the earth.
So is that one of your top policy recommendations?
Yes, there's no question. As you mentioned, I'm working with Natural Resources Defense Council now on housing finance for both resilience and energy efficiency. And I think it's definitely the future. 5 years ago, people scoffed at the idea that we would have energy efficiency housing in the United States. Today, it's a commonplace in every application you see. Where you live in Arizona, where I live in Silver Spring, Maryland, in Iowa, it's not just New York City and Chicago and Los Angeles. It's just not. So I think, yes, I think that's the future. One other thing is today we sit in a place where the coronavirus is on everyone's minds. 10, 15 years ago, the flood in Katrina was on everyone's minds. And as these disaster-related events occur, it's fundamentally important that we build and preserve housing that is resilient to climate change. And some of those are simple things like moving your heaters and heat systems up to the first floor. Some are much more expensive, but I think there's going to be no question that housing agencies are going to be turning towards resilience measures, not just energy retrofits, but resilience measures to try to lower their insurance costs, to try to make them stand up to wind, to tornadoes, to rain events, because those are happening more often, no matter where you live. We had the mildest winter I can remember in Washington, D.C. I didn't wear a heavy coat maybe 3 times this winter. Well, that's just not right. I mean, something's changing, and whether it's man-made or you don't believe that, it's changing. The climate is changing, and more climatic events are coming, and housing needs to be built and preserved to withstand those events.
What would you consider your biggest success story when you look back?
I think probably energy efficiency for all, the collaboration that you mentioned at the beginning. We started working with utility companies, with NRDC in 12 states, ignoring the federal government, ignoring states, and saying, what can utility companies do in these 12 states to provide funding for affordable housing owners, private developers, nonprofits? And within 4 years, we'd raised $500 million, and we're providing energy efficiency for thousands of homes without federal assistance, without state and local assistance from the private utility companies who have it in their interest, candidly, to make sure that they can withstand the stresses on the grid when these climatic events occur. And who, once they understand that low-income households live in energy wasters, in places that need to be energy retrofitted. And if they can do that, they can reduce the stress on their grid. You can devise programs for those utilities, provide grants and low-interest loans to developers. And that's been, frankly, a large success, and one that I'm very proud of, and one that's continuing past my tenure.
I have a lot of people that say that we should build more housing in the urban areas where it's close to transportation, jobs, etc. How do you feel about that?
Well, I'm in favor of that if we can figure out a way to do it affordably. I think one of the, I'm working on in another engagement with hospitals, trying to figure out a way to help deal with the housing impact of transit coming into those hospitals and the loss of housing. In DC, we were having what's called the Purple Line put together to add to our metro system, and housing costs are going up commensurate with the building of the transit infrastructure. There's no question about that. So getting ahead of that is important, and trying to figure out ways to keep the housing affordable near that those transit lines is also important. There's no doubt there's pressure where the jobs are, and the better jobs generally are in urban areas. That's going to continue to probably be the case. And so we have to figure out ways to provide more housing in those places. There's a group in California called YIMBY, Yes in My Backyard. And I've been watching with interest their efforts, and they're trying to reduce zoning restrictions so that, and in Minneapolis, in fact, this happened, you may know. So to the extent we can reduce zoning restrictions, we can have more housing built in those urban areas. I'm not sure that'll happen fast enough to make it affordable. So I'm looking on with interest.
What other things are there that could contribute to affordability? We've mentioned energy efficiency.
Yeah,
I think zoning, maybe.
I do think to the extent we can preserve housing and build housing that's resilient, you're going to reduce insurance costs. The greatest variable operating cost in affordable housing is your energy cost, because it's controllable. Other costs are not controllable. Your staff is not controllable. Generally your real estate taxes are not controllable. All your other costs are really not controllable. Your maintenance is not controllable. Energy efficiency is, and if we can get behind this resilience movement, I think insurance costs could go down, because insurance companies could recognize we're not there yet, but that's where we want to go. And of course, as I mentioned, finding private sector players like hospitals who understand the connection between the number of visits to their ER and homeless patients, and figuring out a way for them to invest in affordable housing nearby. We're on the cusp of that right now. There's lots of good longitudinal studies that have been conducted by Robert Woods Johnson Foundation and others that show the connection between visits to the ER and homelessness. If we can reduce the visits to those ERs, that's the golden rainbow for those hospitals, because their ER visits that are unreimbursed are hugely costly to them. If they can reduce that cost, by an investment in affordable housing nearby, they can, in fact, benefit their bottom line. And that's what's going on. United Healthcare is leading the way. They've right where you live. Where do you live in Arizona?
Tucson.
So in Phoenix, United Healthcare bought a 400-unit deal on its own balance sheet with Chicanos Por La Casa. They set aside 20%, or I think 25% of those units that they would refer to Chicanos Por La Casa from the people who came into their ER, who were homeless. Chicanos Por La Casa had to screen them, didn't accept all of them, and the return on that investment, and I talked to the CFO of United Healthcare, I asked her what was her return on investment, and she said, it's too high, I can't tell you, because it's such a good investment for us. And obviously, to the extent hospitals make this connection between health and affordable housing, providing simple shelter and good and better health outcomes for the people who live in that shelter, it makes more sense for hospitals to be investing. And that's another thing we're on the cusp of. I'm working with 6 hospital systems right now across America with this group called the Center for Community Investment. And it's dramatic. And these are places in Columbus and California and Cincinnati and Prince George's County and Boston and Pittsburgh. And it's once the CEOs kind of get this, it's a good way for hospitals to both give back to their community and protect their bottom line.
Michael, what do you think is a connection with mental health in those areas?
So there are studies actually about housing first, getting people off the street and figuring out ways for them to improve their mental illness simply by keeping them stable. I'm not an expert on that. There are studies that demonstrate housing first for even mentally ill people helps them because it gives them stability. That's a difficult population without significant outside services to help them understand how to take their meds, how to, frankly, navigate the systems that they have to navigate to get their meds. But of course, the cost to society of those people being on the street is huge. If you just take a look at what is going on in San Francisco right now, certain conferences are being canceled because of the homelessness problem and people not wanting to be around homeless people who have mental issues. So it's probably something, there's no doubt there's a connection. There's no doubt that you can demonstrate that connection. How you put together a program that really puts that connection and makes it real, I think is more difficult for mentally ill people simply because of the illness they have, which is on top of being homeless. So I think it's a complicated problem, not as easy to solve as saying a hospital setting aside units for people in their ER, but it's the same kind of thing.
Looking back, what do you feel is your legacy to affordable housing and in general, urban development, whatever?
I think it's connecting lending, finance, and policy. I was very fortunate, very, very fortunate to have been put in a place that allowed me to think beyond policy into finance, into lending, and connecting all those things in a growing organization with wonderful people. I was able to make a difference. I was able to work with really smart, wonderful people, and I had fun. And it's hard to beat that. So I'm thinking that's my legacy. My legacy is putting those things together, working with people who believed and made those connections. And believe me, we had fun. So that's my legacy.
Well, it's a fabulous legacy. What would you tell younger people today, looking at what you've accomplished? What would you tell them?
I think it's really hard for people today, because of what they've lived through, to understand that in general, there's no terrible decision they're going to make that's going to be irreversible. Taking just a small risk on doing whatever you want to do, whether, I must say, when I was a janitor at the University of Iowa, I took pride in my floors. I buffed the floors at the dental school. And I loved that job. And I loved the people I worked with. And just finding a job and wrapping your mind around it and doing well will build your self-confidence. And it really doesn't make, I honestly don't think it's whether it's flipping hamburgers or working at a tech startup. I really don't believe it makes a difference in terms of your long-term self-confidence, which once you establish that, once you feel like you can do something well and you get that, it translates into whatever you do next. I think, and I understand why younger people feel like they have to have a career track and they have to choose the exact right job. And I understand that notion. And I'm not saying it's invalid, but I would temper it by saying, even if you don't get the right job the first time, even if it doesn't turn out to be the exact right thing, wrapping your mind around it, doing the best with it will make you a more confident person. And more confident people are happier, they do better in life, and they make friends, and that's what we know. So try to build your self-confidence with whatever you do.
Well, Michael, you've made a huge contribution to society, in essence, because you've gone through society. Well, you have so many different aspects that you have touched, where a lot of people kind of have touched one area. You've touched clearly 3 or more. And that's huge. Do you have anything else you would like to say to listeners?
I would just say, for those of you who are considering or are contemplating getting into the affordable housing world, it's a wonderful life. I didn't pick it; it picked me, and I was very fortunate. And if you find this of interest, I wouldn't be daunted by the fact that you can't make enough money. I would figure out a way to dive in and work with people, like-minded people, have fun, make a difference. The affordable housing world gives you that and more.
Well, thank you so much for your time and your contribution. And we wish you much success in continuing to develop more great policy.
Thank you, Dan. Thank you so much. Bye-bye.